This video is meant for those of us who have been doing this for 10 plus years, people who have been doing this for 3 to 5 years, but they want to be doing this for 15 to 20 years. It's the people who have all these things down. What's up, guys? So today I'm going to make an important video, a video that I really think is probably going to be a mainstay of the channel, one that I reference in the future, because a lot of people know I discuss genetics on the podcast quite a bit. And so here I want to discuss the importance of genetics, why I bring it up, and its relevance to most lifters. The topic of genetics is always popular in the lifting space, and I do think some people overemphasize it. I also think some people dismiss the importance of genetics very frequently, and I think it should be something in between, but I also think there's a lot of nuance as to how it affects individuals and how it affects people's perceptions. Now, I've seen a number of videos recently discussing the topic of genetic potential and how much it influences one's results, and I have a lot of thoughts. So I'm going to be mentioning some specific names here. I'm going to be discussing natural hypertrophy, Jeffrey Verdi Schofield, Alpha Destiny, the 3DMJ guys, Brian Borstein, Abel, college friends of mine, a lot of examples here. And then I'm going to have a wrap up at the end that I think is very relevant as to my true thoughts on when this should be factored in. So please listen to the end here because it is going to be important. And I think if you only listen to half, you're going to get an incorrect perception of my thoughts. Now, I would first say that when I talk about genetics, my goal is to never be disheartening. I know some people say, well, if you can't do anything about it, then why do we even need to discuss it? And I am not here to tell somebody that they have limitations or that they should stop trying for a goal. In fact, I actually agree with some who say that it can even be helpful at times to be a little delusional about what's possible, because you will have that initial motivation getting into something. You will try harder because you think more is possible. And even if you don't achieve that very lofty goal, you'll get further than you would have otherwise gotten. That has applied to me in many areas of life where I've done pretty well and I maybe didn't get as far as I would have liked. Certainly in lifting, right? When I first started, I was 130 pounds, very, very skinny. I kind of arbitrarily wanted to be 225 pounds and 10% body fat. Obviously, I'm not even close to that, but I got pretty far compared to where I started. So I'm not saying in any way this should demotivate people. And again, I will circle back to that at the end. However, on the contrary, I think some people acting like it doesn't matter at all can actually be harmful, because sometimes people will make it seem like it has almost no influence, or that it applies to the genetic elite, but for everybody else, we can all follow the same thing and get about the same results. And I think that that message can be harmful, because for people who are actually trying very hard and not seeing the results that they want, certainly we can try to improve their nutrition and their training and other factors. But I think the knowledge that there's this huge other component, which is their genetics, should be considered, because they might think that they're doing things wrong when they're really not. And they might spend years and years going down all of these paths and listening to people they shouldn't be listening to because they're trying to achieve those results. Now, how important would I say genetics actually are? Obviously, this is a very difficult question to answer, because if you looked at, for example, people saying, well, how important is training versus nutrition? Is one 80% versus 20%? I would say, well, you could say each is 100%. And it's almost like a cliche for some people to say that it's 100% this and 100% this and 100% this. But in reality, if you imagined you didn't do anything in one of those areas, you would get no results. So if somebody literally didn't train, right, you could have perfect nutrition, you're not going to gain much muscle. If somebody had the best training routine possible, but they ate 1,000 calories a day and 20 grams of protein, they are not going to gain much muscle. And I would even say that at the extreme ends of it, if you had perfect training and nutrition, but you just had the worst genetics on the planet and you were one of these non-responders in studies, which again, I'm not saying those studies don't have their own flaws, but somebody out there could get almost no results, right? That could happen. And so it's impossible to quantify exactly how important each one is. Additionally, it depends on if minimum requirements are met. So what do I mean by that? Let's break it down within nutrition. Maybe you say, well, what's more important, my protein or my carbs? What should I add more, which is more important? Well, it depends on what level they're already at. So if you are a 200-pound male and you're already eating 200 grams of protein, then we could make an argument to say, well, for you, adding more carbs is more important. Carbs are more important. But if you were eating 20 grams of protein, then for you, almost certainly protein is more important because you're lacking in that area. So there's obviously a difficulty in answering a specific percentage of how important something is. And that's really not my goal, or should be anybody's goal, is to find out the exact percentage. It's just to say that these things are all important. To me, it's no different than other sports. In fact, there is a stronger genetic influence than other sports. So for example, basketball. Nobody would try to argue that height isn't a huge advantage. I have a friend who is 5'7" who plays routinely. I haven't played since I was 12 years old. And when we played, I actually beat him by 1 point because I have such an advantage over him due to my height, despite the fact that I haven't played in well over a decade, really 2 decades. The reason I say it's actually more important in bodybuilding than in, let's say, tennis, is that there's a huge skill component when it comes to these other sports. So even if somebody had great genetics for tennis, whatever that would entail, and somebody else had 30th percentile genetics, that person, the 30th percentile person, if they played for 10 years and the other person played for 6 months, they would probably stomp them because there is such a skill component. Now, maybe within 2, 3, 4 years, that person with the better genetics would beat them, but there is a huge skill component to it. Conversely, when it comes to bodybuilding, you're really talking about one's natural structure, right? Your bone structure, your insertions, these you can't do anything about, of course, and your ability to gain muscle, which is kind of like what I would call a base factor. So again, sprinting speed is kind of a base factor there that comes into play in a lot of sports, but then there's also that neurological adaptation in many of these other sports that, sure, it exists in sprinting, but not to the same extent, right? Some people are just naturally far faster than others. Some people can put on muscle far better than others. Now, as a thought experiment, let's have 3 groups. So group A, 100 identical clones genetically. Their training is identical, but their nutrition is going to be manipulated in the reasonable ways that we would talk about, right? Not like, okay, this person has Twinkies all day, but in the ways that we act like nutrition makes a big deal. If we do this or we do that, they're going to manipulate their nutrition. So maybe somebody is going to have a ketogenic diet. Somebody's going to have a very high carb, low fat diet. Somebody's going to have a balanced diet. Somebody's going to do a carnivore diet. Somebody's going to do intermittent fasting with another type of diet. All of that is going to be varied. Then group B, again, 100 clones and identical nutrition, but their training is going to vary. And again, within the reasonable boundaries that we talk about when we have these podcasts discussing what's ideal training and these studies on what's ideal training. So it's not going to be they don't train at all versus an ideal routine. It's going to be, okay, so lower volume, higher intensity, like a HIIT style routine, right? And maybe like a Arnold style routine, and then a max OT style routine, and then maybe more of like a strongman training and powerlifting training, etc. But again, nutrition and genetics identical, okay? And then the third group, and they are going to have identical training and identical nutrition. But these 100 individuals are going to be 100 males picked at random among the population, right? Completely different genetics, just picked at random. If you don't think that third group is, after 5 years of this experiment, going to have by far the biggest variation in physiques, I don't know what to tell you. Because to me, it's extremely obvious that when you look at the genetic variation among individuals, there are such huge variations in how we look, how people gain muscle, height, symmetry, all of these things. To think that this group of completely genetically different individuals, just 100 men chosen at random, would not have more significant differences in their results than identical clones who just manipulated training or just manipulated diet, I think is preposterous. I can't imagine that somebody would think that that third group would actually look more similar in their physiques than the two other groups. To me, it's hard to imagine that not being the case. And I think that does demonstrate that the variability in results is more to do with one's genetics. I'm in no way saying nutrition doesn't play a huge factor. I'm in no way saying training doesn't play a huge factor. But I think there is so much evidence in many walks of life that there is a ton of variation between individuals. Again, it's hard to imagine anybody thinks otherwise. So a lot of human traits, right? We're used to this kind of bell-shaped Gaussian distribution. And sure, this is average, but there's people all along, right? And there's huge variations from men who are 4'10" to men who are 7'2", right? Tons of variation. And there's no reason to think that the ability to gain muscle would not fall on a similar distribution. We have studies showing that when they compare high volume versus low volume, or higher frequency versus lower frequency, we'll see, okay, well, maybe the higher volume showed better results. And then you look at the individual data points and it is all over the place, right? The variation between individuals is so much greater than the variation between the groups, right? And meaning that if the low volume group, there was way more variation between those people, even though they're doing the same thing, than the two groups themselves. And again, I think that speaks to this point. Now, a common sentiment that I see some people say, and actually Natural Hypertrophy on my podcast recently said this, is they'll say, yes, of course, you have this person who is a genetic elite, but that doesn't apply to the rest of us. And to me, and again, it's not just him saying that, many people say that, oh, okay, well, Ronnie did it, but that's not what we could do. Or this person did it, Doug Miller does it, but it's not what we could do. But they act as if it's like there's all of us, and then there's the genetic elite. And in reality, there's everything in between, right? So if there's somebody who is 5'10", 205 on stage, it's not like everybody else is 5'10", 170, and then it just jumps to that. There is somebody who is the 50th percentile genetics, the 52nd percentile genetics, the 60th percentile genetics, on and on until the 100th percentile, right? All of those exist. So to act like the rules are just different for that one person, but everybody else should be about the same, it's creating a false dichotomy. The reality is there is a range and there's a distribution and there's people along the entire distribution. You know, one thing I like to point out that nobody really talks about is that, I've heard people say that the kind of classic natural bodybuilder is about 5'10", maybe 160 pounds on stage. If you look at Alberto Nunez, he falls right around there. If you look at Brad Loomis, he was about 155, right? But then you have some true freaks out there. Lane Norton, 5'10", 195 pounds on stage. Doug Miller, I think also around 5'10", also around 190 to 195 pounds on stage. Crazy, right? Now, the reality is Alberto Nunez is not average, right? He's clearly above average. I would say Brad Loomis is probably your classic average bodybuilder, right? Yeah, now he's a pro, he's awesome. I'm just saying, genetically speaking, he said this himself, he's probably around average. Well, again, following the distribution, if there is somebody who is competing about average, 5'10", let's just say 160, and somebody else, the genetic elite, competing at 190, 195, similar height on stage, then almost by definition, there is somebody out there, probably many people out there, who could compete at the same height and show up on stage in the 130s. Now, that sounds crazy to us. Hold on, a bodybuilder standing on stage at 5'9", 5'10", 130 pounds, they must be completely new to it. They don't know what they're doing. How is that possible? We almost never see that. But why wouldn't we see that? Because people gravitate towards what they're good at. If you go to the gym and you blow up and you get all these compliments and you are the top of your hierarchy, then you're gonna have a ton of positive feedback and you're gonna go on to do it again and again and again. If you go in and you're not gaining muscle and you try this and you're not gaining muscle and maybe you diet down and you look so skinny and people think you're sick. I mean, people think normal natural bodybuilders look sick when they diet down to be contest lean. So imagine that minus 30 pounds of muscle, you're not gonna do it. People who are in the bottom 10th, 20th percentile of an activity generally do not stick with it, right? Now, I think everybody should lift for health reasons and things like that, but you're generally not gonna be a competitive bodybuilder if your genetics for it are that bad. But again, almost by definition, if a Doug Miller can exist, then somebody on the opposite side of the spectrum can exist. And as hard as it is for us to imagine somebody putting in 20 years and being 5'10", 135 pounds on stage, that person is out there almost by definition. Now, as I implied, this is gonna be a pretty long and comprehensive video, one that I will probably reference back a number of times. So you might be thinking at this point that I am nihilistic about one's training potential if they have bad genetics, or that I might be deterministic about what one can do. And again, I will wrap up at the end saying how I think this applies. But first, I'm going to go into a story time about my lifting journey. So if you've listened to the podcast for a while, you probably have a general idea of my progression over the years. But very few people know all of the details. And of course, I can't go into all of the details here, but I'm going to go into more detail and you're gonna see some unseen pictures of me over the years. And I have to laugh because I saw a post by Jeffrey Verity Schofield recently, something along the lines of, the harder I try and the longer I do this, the better people say my genetics are. And I've heard many people say that, right? Oh, the more I put into it, the better my genetics become. And he's totally right. You know, the bigger we get and the more we put into this and the more results we see, people say, oh, wow, you're built for it. Actually, even my parents recently, I had this happen where my dad said something along the lines of, oh, well, when he, referring to me, eats that way, meaning eating a ton of junk like I was at this party, it doesn't really affect him. Now, meanwhile, my dad saw me grow up as a fat kid and then saw me get borderline anorexically skinny. And yet, because of the results I have now and controlling my diet at other times, in his mind, it's, oh, well, he can do this. When in reality, it's like, well, no, I mean, you've seen the effort I put in over the years, but people often see a snapshot, they see there, and they don't see the work that's come in. I have recently had somebody in my comments section tell me that I need to stop saying I have average or even below average genetics because I probably have pretty good genetics. And it made me laugh because I will show you my progression over the years and you can see why I think that is a very silly notion. Now, again, I don't think I have bad genetics overall. I think I have bad genetics for bodybuilding, but I will now show you my progression over the years and you can kind of see where some of that frustration has come from. All right, so here we get a nice bicep flex, right? If I wanted to be like a lot of Instagrammers, I'd put this as my before picture and I tell you how I gained 150 pounds of muscle since then. But I will just show you this nice cute bicep flex of the early days of Dave McConey. Now, here is a picture before I did any real lifting. So this was my freshman year of high school at 130 pounds. Now, keep in mind, this was not an untrained individual. Throughout 8th grade, I did start working out, right? With 20-pound dumbbells, just doing some stuff at home. Basic routine, but I was doing some basic lifting. I had played sports all my life up to this point. So this was not just some inactive person on the couch. This was somebody who had had some basic training, okay? Now, 135 pounds, at the time, probably about 5'10". I'm now 6'1", so some of what I've gained is just lean body mass, like organ and tissue weight and bone weight and things like that, but most has been muscle. 130 pounds. Now, many of you guys have heard me say that once I read Body for Life at the end of my freshman year, I was hooked. I was all about it. I read constantly. I was on forums. I have tens of thousands of posts on various forums over the years. I just totally caught the bug, right? And I trained harder than anybody I knew at the time. Actually, I would still to this day say that high school Dave trained harder than anybody I've met in person, right? At least prior to starting the podcast and finally meeting a lot of more like-minded individuals. But I was training very, very hard. I was putting a ton of effort into it. And importantly, I was doing things correctly. I had a high protein, healthy diet. I was, at the time, it was thought that you really needed to eat 6 or 7 meals a day. So I was doing that. I was getting up at 5 in the morning because I didn't have a car yet. So I was going to the gym with my dad. I turned down many, many social opportunities, which I should not have done, but I did. I never drank, I never smoked, I never did anything. I just followed everything as well as I possibly could. I ate a caloric surplus, and then as I got a little too fat, if I got close to 20+% body fat, I dieted down. So I wasn't somebody who was just trying to stay lean by any stretch of the imagination. I never really had abs throughout all of high school. Once I got up there, I cut down to maybe 12% or so, rinse and repeat, slowly gaining over time. And I will show you my senior year on my way to college. This was where I was after 3 very intense years and gaining 25 pounds of muscle. So this was me the summer before going to college. That is 25 pounds on top of where I started. Gained a lot of strength. My arms went from maybe 12 inches to 14.5 inches. So I had actually gained a ton. And this is where I was after 3 years. Now, for reference, this is a picture of Jeff Alberts, I believe his senior year of high school as well, after I believe a similar amount of time training. So this is Jeff, and this is me after 3 years of training, and we can compare the genetic response to training there. And I was training very hard. Now, I go away to college, freshman year, I bulk up about 25 pounds, I then cut down, and I netted about 7 pounds of muscle. Fantastic, right? That's pretty solid after now 4 or 5 years of training. But how did I look? This is how I looked. So as I mentioned, I started at 130 pounds. I was then 155 pounds when I graduated high school. This was me at 162 pounds, very similar leanness. So now you're talking 32 pounds of lean body mass more than when I had started, just to look like basically a skinny kid, okay? Here is a even less flattering picture that I have of me. Again, same weight, about 162 pounds here after 4 or 5 years of very dedicated lifting. Now my sophomore year, now we're getting into about 6 years of lifting. Okay, I bulked up again, 25 pounds. I cut down, I actually netted 8 pounds. Fantastic year of lifting. Put 100 pounds on my deadlift, right? 8 pounds of muscle at the same leanness after dieting back down. And here's a picture there that summer. Now you can see that I'm now putting on some noticeable muscle. I look like a more athletic individual, but we're still talking 170 pounds or so, right? At 6'1", that's still not a terribly big guy for somebody who's been lifting for 6 years. By contrast, here are some pictures of Eric Helms after he had started lifting, actually at the same time, about 2005 or so, I believe. After, he can correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is about 5 years of lifting for him. So Eric Helms, 5 years versus me, 5 years of lifting. And this picture is me also around 5 years of lifting, looking basically like nothing next to my friend Dave, who had been lifting about half the time I had been. And obviously physique-wise totally trounces me here. Now as a side note, one of the reasons that I am not a fan of maintaining or gaintaining is that once I got to about this size, I spent a year spinning my wheels trying to bulk up 5 pounds, cut down 5 pounds, bulk up 5 pounds, cut down 5 pounds, trying to recomp, gain a little muscle, then lose some fat, and I got nowhere. Now clearly I wasn't even near my potential because I'm now about 195. So even having still so much more to gain, I still was not going anywhere by trying this gaintaining approach. So just a side note, one of the reasons that I am not a fan of it. Now, fast forward another couple of years, I then went to dental school, again, bulked up, cut down, bulked up, cut down. This was me after about another, I would say 7 or 8 pounds of muscle. That took another 2 years or so. And now at this point, you can see just being at the beach, clearly some muscle, not a huge guy by any stretch of the imagination, probably about 185 here. Looking okay. Here's another one not too long ago, sitting about 190. And then this picture was taken for like a dental school superlative of most likely to be found in the gym, me and another guy there. And at this point, I'm probably about 200 pounds, certainly not as lean as some of the other pictures. Arms were about 16.5 to 17 inches. Now in this picture, I'm probably about 25 or so, and I haven't really progressed too much beyond that. You know, I've hit some PRs here and there. At one point I bulked up much more and I got significantly fatter. I got up to about 220. My arms were 17.5 inches. I hit some PRs, a lot of PRs, and I thought it was a good thing to do. I think most people should at some point push a bulk pretty far to see what is left in the tank. I think that's one of the reasons that Jeffrey Schofield is still making great progress. I think that's one of the reasons that Steve Hall made great progress even after lifting for a while as he pushed his weight to new boundaries. I think you're doing a disservice if you never try pushing the envelope there to see what you can get. And again, I was never one who shied away from, I was routinely, even in high school, bulking up to 20+% body fat. But I wanted to show these pictures because people maybe see me now and I think I have a decent physique, I have an athletic physique, but people often have no idea how many years I went literally just trying to look like I had picked up a weight in my life. I mean, I was about 7 years into lifting before I even remotely looked like I lifted. Now you contrast that with somebody like Jeffrey Schofield and Eric Helms, some of these other people after 7 years of lifting. I mean, Steve Hall, I think, competed after 6 or 7 years of lifting. I think Eric Helms competed after 6 or 7 years of lifting. That's not uncommon. Now, one thing that is important to note is because I started so young, it would not be reasonable to expect the same results. Meaning if you started at 20 years old, and you lifted until 25, that person cannot be compared to somebody who started at 12 and is now 17, right? Hormonally, things are just not gonna be in place developmentally to even achieve the same results. So I'm not saying that if I started at 20, that at 25, I would be where I was in the pictures you saw me at 17 or 18 years old. What I am saying is that it was still a very, very, very long, slow process to even get there. And I had many people around me in high school and college who trounced me with a third of the time and maybe a quarter of the effort. So the effort and the dedication and everything was there the whole time. Now, this video is not supposed to be specifically about me. But of course, we are all gonna be biased by our own experiences. So the point is not to make this all about me. I wanted to put my kind of story time in there and my anecdote. We're all gonna be influenced by our own biases and our own experiences, of course, but I mostly wanted to show you that despite a ton of effort being there and a ton of dedication and training correctly, eating correctly, the results were really not nearly what I expected them to be. And a lot of people would have said, well, this person doesn't know what they're doing if they don't have those results. Now, if anybody's looking at these pictures and thinking, well, clearly you didn't know what you're doing. As I've mentioned, I already had some really great influences at the time, right? I mean, people who were talking about progressive overload, good nutrition, good training. I never bought into supplement hype or anything like that. I had a lot of good influences. As I mentioned, I spent time slowly gaining 1 or 2 pounds a week, maybe even half a pound to 1 pound per week over time, getting up to about 20% body fat, and then appropriately cutting down to maybe 12%. I never tried to get stupid lean. I never tried to do anything silly like that. I had a lot of good influences early, and my training was very progressive. Now I'm gonna show you a picture of me, my hunky 6'1", 170 pound self here. If I told you the stats, you'd probably be surprised to hear that this guy was incline benching 225 for 7, front squatting 225 for 15, deadlifting 405 for 12, I have videos of it, shoulder pressing 90-pound dumbbells for 6 to 8 reps. I had impressive strength for my size. I was stronger than most people in my college gym. You know, if you exclude like the football athletes, as far as most people lifting in the regular gym, I was one of the strongest there. So I was doing things appropriately, and I had actually gained 40 plus pounds of lean body mass from where I started. But look at where I started. So I mostly wanted to put this out there so you could see the progression, and you can understand then why I will have a strong reaction when I hear something like this.
You just don't train hard. That's the reason why you don't have a good physique.
I took offense to that. That's all I needed for him to do that. And it became personal with me.
So you can see why I have a bias against that, because it's like, well, okay, I'm sure you tried very hard, just like I will kind of have a similar reaction when I've heard Layne Norton say on podcasts, well, if I have any genetic advantage, it's that I just am willing to outwork everybody else in the room. And it's like, okay, a lot of people say that. First of all, I've even heard Ben Pekulski say that, which I'm not even gonna get into that. Top 6 IFBB pro saying that, but Layne Norton was a world record holder in the squat, a highly accomplished powerlifter, an accomplished bodybuilder competing at 195 pounds peeled on stage. Clearly has fantastic genetics, and I've since heard him admit on my podcast and others that he does have very good genetics, but the point still stands that he has said that, and it's like, look, I know that he's an extremely hard worker. I believe that he really does outwork most people, but that is not there without significantly above average genetics, which he very clearly has. Something that kind of made me laugh was when I heard Natural Hypertrophy say, I can't imagine anybody doing everything I've done and not having at least as good of a physique as I have. And the reason I laughed is because I've said almost that exact same thing. And I mean, I've said it many times. And the reality is I believe that. I have truly, I have until the podcast never met a single person in my life, as I mentioned before, who had tried as hard in this endeavor as I have. Since the podcast, I've been fortunate enough to meet some people who are as crazy as I was or am. So now I have met some of these individuals, but truly in person, I just didn't know anybody who had put in the effort that I had put in. Yet I knew many, many, many people who had more impressive physiques. So I really meant it when I said, I can't imagine somebody doing what I have done for now 18 years and not being at least as impressive. But the difference is when Natural Hypertrophy says it, he is 20 pounds more muscular than I am. So both cannot be true, right? I mean, we can't both be average. Now, I think an argument can be made that I'm below average and he's average, or that I'm average and he's above average. Or it could be I'm 40th percentile, he's 60th percentile. Whatever the case, but both of those statements cannot be true. And I think the reality is, and this applies to me as much as anybody else, it's pretty much impossible for us to not have a huge bias towards our own personal experiences, right? When we are able to accomplish something, we assume that others should be able to accomplish it as well if they just do what we did, or at least close. So I happen to see a great example of this with Johnny Candido. Now, I like Candido. I followed Candido's routines numerous times in the past. I think he's a great resource, so I would check him out if you haven't. But he recently said this.
I would say most people can squat 500 pounds with moderate training. I would say most people can squat 500 pounds with moderate training.
Now, this was amazing to me. I had to go back and listen to this several times to say that most people, so more than half of people, could hit a 500-pound squat with moderate training. Now, I would call moderate training 3 to 4 times per week for 4 to 5 years, maybe 6 years. That's what I would consider moderate training. But I wouldn't even say most people can hit a 500-pound squat ever. Now, if he said in one's lifetime dedicated to powerlifting, maybe I disagree, but it wouldn't be worth bringing up. But most people can hit a 500-pound squat with moderate training is a shocking statement to me. So I looked into it a little bit further and I talked to some other people, and certainly that is elite level strength by most standards. But it's not even just about most people. So I'm gonna show some pictures of my friend Jimmy. He was known among our group as having pretty good genetics, responded very well, very thick guy, clearly surpassed me and most of my friends within a couple of years of lifting. Now, after a serious attempt of getting as strong as possible, Jimmy hit a 425 squat. Now, could he squat more than that? I'm sure with more training, he could squat more than that. But after years of dedication and trying very hard, somebody who had above average genetics hit a 425 squat. I reached out to Alberto Nunez to ask them what all of their squats were. Keep in mind, these guys have probably on average lifted 25 years. Now, I know years ago, they had a competition to see who could hit a 500-pound squat first. And I think due to injuries and some other things, none of them hit it. Now, years later, Alberto hit a 525 squat. And again, he has said that within a couple of years of lifting, he was blowing past his friends. Eric Helms, who also has said that he has above average genetics and he thought he had really good genetics when he started lifting. Then among bodybuilders, he thinks he's probably average among bodybuilders. After 20 years of lifting and competing in powerlifting plenty, I believe his highest squat was somewhere between 475 and 495, maybe a 500 in the gym, but competition upper 400s. Brad Loomis, 25 to 30 years of lifting, many powerlifting competitions, 475. And I believe Jeff Alberts hit somewhere between a 450 and a 475. So all guys except maybe Brad with above average genetics, some well above average genetics, 3 of whom have actually competed in powerlifting, and only one of them has hit above a 500-pound squat. I have one friend I can think of who has actually squatted, again, like an actual person I know in person, right? Not just YouTube videos. Out of all the gyms I've been to, out of all the people I've seen lifting, I can think of one friend who has above a 500-pound squat, who is 5'7" and 220 pounds and competes in powerlifting, and he's been lifting for 10 years. And I could give more and more examples of this. Brian Borstein, incredibly impressive physique, right? Natural lifter. Highest he's ever squatted was 425. I spent 12 years probably getting to a low 400-pound squat as well, doing actual powerlifting training, Bulgarian style training, things like that. The point is a 500-pound squat is amazing, right? For most gyms, it's amazing. Now in the world of TikTok and YouTube and things like that, it's not that impressive. But in real life, it's extremely rare that somebody has a 500-pound squat. But Candido is a 600+ pound squatter. So even if he recognizes, well, not everybody can do what I can do, in his mind, well, not everybody can do what I can do, but they should at least be able to do this. And in this case, that's a 500-pound squat, saying most people can do it with moderate training. So I'm not trying to rag on Candido at all here specifically. I'm just saying this is a great example of people having a strong bias towards what they can do and having a very hard time stepping back and understanding that not everybody else can do those same things. So I can relate this to another area of my life where I tried very hard, but I was much more accomplished than I would say in bodybuilding, which was academia. So if you look at some people on social media, even my friends do this, they'll say, well, I didn't have good genetics because look at where I was before I started. Or I didn't have good genetics, look at me when I was 10 years old. And it's obviously not that relevant to their genetic response to training, right? So I could say in middle school, I wasn't a good student because I didn't try. But immediately once I started trying, I was a straight A student in high school. I graduated top 5 to 10 in my class. In college, again, straight A's. I graduated number 1 in my entire major. And then when I went to take the dental admissions test, I scored 99.7th percentile among people who took the test, who are obviously already going to be above average students. It's not something I bring up that much, but it's a good example here because we have really the 2 areas of my life that I've tried the hardest, which was academic performance and lifting performance. And in lifting performance, I really didn't get that far relative to people who put in the effort, whereas in academic performance, I got as far as I wanted to get, right? Once I got to dental school, that was the goal. So it's not like I wanted to then go on to get more degrees or anything like that, but it wasn't even that hard for me. I tried hard, but I saw people trying just as hard and studying just as hard, even smart individuals who just did not have nearly as good a performance as I did. I tutored people, and that was very eye-opening, which I think is eye-opening for a lot of coaches too, right? Once you coach a lot of people, you see, oh wow, this person is putting in the effort and they're blowing up, or they're not getting that great a result. As somebody who tutored people, I would see people put in a lot of effort and say, wow, like it's just not coming to them in the same way. And I think it's probably good to have that anecdote in there because, you get some people who unfortunately are just not accomplished anywhere in life. And they come across as somebody who is just complaining, right? They say the whole world is against them. And I'm definitely not saying that at all. So don't mistake what I'm saying. I'm very appreciative of many things in my life. All I'm saying is that if we look at it, here's one area where I tried and it worked out exactly as we're all told as kids. The more you try, the better it gets and the more you accomplish. And then there was another one where it's like, oh, well, it didn't really work out as I expected. So I just think it's a relevant message as a comparison point. And related to that comparison point, imagine if we had students who were not performing that well. We would probably do everything we can to make sure they are performing better. But at the end of the day, most people, if they're familiar with the literature on genetics and IQ and genetics and school performance and things like that, they would probably understand that, look, we can do things to improve your performance and we can try to put you in peer groups that are going to help your performance and we can teach you in certain ways that are going to help. But at the end of the day, imagine how bad a student might feel if they were trying really hard and they just could not do as well as somebody else in their class. If the message was, well, you're clearly not trying as hard as they are, you're clearly not studying, even though that person knows they are, that would be probably detrimental to their self-image because they would just think something is wrong with me. And again, you don't want to have this deterministic viewpoint, but I think the truth about one's limitations can be helpful in understanding and then maybe using that to say, hey, maybe you're better at this thing, or maybe you excel here, or if you're going to do something that you don't excel at, maybe you can do it for the enjoyment of it and understand that maybe you're not going to be the best. So again, I understand how if this is your first time seeing the channel or anything like that, you could think that this is this nihilistic viewpoint that, everything is controlled and you can't do what you want. And I really don't want it to be that way at all. I'm in no way trying to be negative about this. I think understanding the truth in general, not even just with lifting, just truth in general can be helpful because it can help you either accept certain things or pivot into something that you're going to be more successful at, right? And so if you have the goal to be as muscular as possible, but you have maybe less than ideal genetics, I'm in no way saying you shouldn't go after it. What I am saying is that you just need to understand that it's not necessarily that you're doing something wrong. Not to take the easy route out, not to say, well, it's all genetics, so I don't need to focus on the fact that I'm only sleeping 6 hours and my nutrition is garbage and my training is garbage. Not at all. I think all of those things should be optimized as best as you can within your abilities. But understand that the difference between most people you see who are doing at least the basics does generally come down to their genetics, right? The difference between a Brad Loomis at 155 pounds on stage and a Jeff Alberts at 175 pounds on stage and a Doug Miller at 195 pounds on stage is not that one is training so much harder than the other. I'm sure Jeff Alberts would not say that he has just put in way more effort than Brad Loomis. And again, I'm not trying to knock Brad at all here. I think Brad is a great bodybuilder and a great guy. I'm just saying that by his own admission, he has more or less average genetics. And so he's a good example here that somebody who's worked his butt off for 25 plus years is just not going to be in the realm of a competitor as a Doug Miller, right? And I don't think even a Doug Miller would say, well, Brad's just not trying hard enough, right? That would be, I think, silly. And so once you have those basics, to me, it's really fun to say, well, what can I manipulate in my training to get a little bit more out? And how can I change my training or the timing of something or my sleep to improve my results? However, it should not be a message out there that the reason X person looks this way is because his nutrition is on point or his trainer is on point, or that's the only reason. Because frankly, once you have the basics down, once you have a sound routine, once you have progressive overload implemented into that routine, once you have sufficient protein and a caloric surplus over years of consistency, that's 90% of it. And all these little other things are great. They're a lot of fun. If you're like me, you like to see the research, you like mass reviews and things like that. But understand that beyond that point, going back to my example with the 3 groups and the 100 clones earlier, Understand that the genetic variation between individuals is going to be the reason that they look significantly different. I'm sure Brian Borstein, if he wants to chime in, would say that he and I have both put in an incredible amount of effort, yet he's 2 inches shorter than me, and I've got 20 pounds less muscle than him, right? And again, not just to use me as an example, there's many other examples. Look at a Pascal Floor versus a Steve Hall, right? Steve Hall has lifted a little bit longer, but they're both extremely dedicated, and yet Steve is far, far more advanced as a bodybuilder than Pascal is. Not to say that Pascal won't continue to progress, but the difference is not that their training is so different. The difference is not that their nutrition is so different. The difference is that they are different people and they have different genetics and they will have vastly different physiques at the end of the day. So as a final example here, as an analogy, one could say, well, again, we understand it, but do we need to focus on it? And I would actually say, no, I don't think it should be focused on, which might sound totally counterintuitive when I'm spending so much time talking about it. But the reason I'm talking about it is because sometimes it's acted like it's not understood. So, for example, if we took male and female athletes, we would say that most people understand males on average are going to be much stronger and faster and heavier than women, right? Many examples where a high school even, or especially college male athlete dominates the performance of a female athlete. And we all understand that. So it would be weird if you had a female soccer team, for example, and the coach kept telling them, well, look, we're gonna do these drills and we're gonna improve as much as possible, but just so you know, you're never gonna be at the level as the male team. That would be weird because they already understand, yes, we know we're not gonna be as strong or as fast as them. Not to say that women can't compete in certain areas, but on average, we know that men are going to be much stronger and faster. So you wouldn't just keep beating that into their head, but at the same time, we do not have programs out there telling women that if you were to just train this way, you'd be as big and strong as the men. We do not have supplements being sold for that reason. We do not have the idea that a woman doesn't know as much as a man because she's not as big and strong, right? We obviously find all those things ridiculous because it's understood that genetically, a woman is going to, on average, be much weaker and smaller than a man. And yet, the reality is, if you look at the average male and female height, for example, the variation in height among men is so much more than the average difference between men and women in height. I would bet that would apply to strength. I don't know what the average, let's say, squat of a woman is versus the average squat of a man, but I would be almost sure that the variation in squat strength among all men would be significantly greater than the average strength difference between men and women. And obviously strength is one of the biggest differences. So I'm bringing it up because we don't mention that because we just know that that is the case. And the reason I bring the genetics up among, let's say, men is that I often see people say things that indicate, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, that the reason that they have this different physique or these results is because of some training variable, right? Almost famously at this point, I brought it up a couple times, Brian Whitaker said, well, when you see Doug Miller and how he trains, you understand why he looks like he does. And it was like, well, hold on, Brian, Doug competes 40 pounds heavier than you do. I know you train extremely hard. I know you're extremely dedicated. So what's the difference? The difference is obviously the genetics, right? Doug Miller has way, way more muscle than Brian Whitaker. Brian Whitaker, amazing, amazing natural bodybuilder. But what's the difference? That's not their training, it's not their nutrition, it's that genetically, they are vastly different. On the extreme ends, you see some huge variation. So I wouldn't mention it so much if I didn't see so much put out there on this is the reason, this training is the reason, this nutrition is the reason. This person clearly knows what they're talking about. And a lot of you guys listening probably know that, but among the general population, it is extremely, extremely, extremely common to believe that X person, even celebrities, oh, Chris Hemsworth, he must have the best training app in the world because look at how he looks, or many, many other examples. So again, I hope the tone here does not come across as pessimistic or negative. I even look at myself as somebody who took a long time, as you saw, to get to a pretty good physique. But I'm very happy that I did it. I can't imagine my life without lifting. So I would never tell anybody to not shoot for the moon. I still have goals that I want to hit. I'm very glad I got into this endeavor. I think almost everybody should try to do what they can and see what they can achieve physically. I think we have many great examples of people to follow in the industry, from all the 3DMJ guys I've mentioned to Jeffrey Very Schofield, Alpha Destiny, other people, Brian Borstein, Abel Chabayi, Steve Hall, all of these people are great, and many, many more I'm sure I didn't name. The reason I have this video is because sometimes people ask me my opinion on genetics, or I just don't want to reference it over and over and over again. This is obviously a very long video, so this will probably be a video that I would just say, check out my thoughts here. As a quick summary, I think it is a hugely, hugely important variable as far as where you are going to end up. However, if you don't have your nutrition optimized, your training optimized, your sleep optimized, your stress control optimized, all of these things, you're never going to get where you otherwise could get. But don't think that the difference between somebody who is on stage at 200 and somebody on stage at 170 is necessarily due to a training difference. At that level, once you're at the point of competing and you've been doing this for 10 plus years and you've been progressive, you've been consistent, at that point, the difference is largely genetic. But if you haven't even gotten to the point of doing those things, of course, that's what you should focus on. And as I've said before on other podcasts, if I was talking to the lay person, I wouldn't even mention this, because why am I going to tell somebody who's not even doing these things that there's such a genetic influence? I would say focus on all these things that are in your control. This video is meant for those of us who have been doing this for 10 plus years, people who have been doing this for 3 to 5 years, but they want to be doing this for 15 to 20 years. It's the people who have all these things down, and importantly, maybe for somebody like me in high school who would beat themselves up thinking that they weren't doing things correctly or there was something that they were missing because they weren't getting the results that they wanted to get. So coaches can be great for this, finding mentors can be great for this, finding the right sources online can be great for this, and trying as hard as you can. So I want to stay very positive with this, but I still think that it's important to understand that this factor exists and to not ignore it. So guys, probably one of my longest videos, a lot of ranting, some funny story time. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you completely agree with me or you completely disagree with me, I'd actually love to have a discussion on this. So feel free to comment down below. Tell me where you think I might be wrong. Maybe you have experience that would counter what I've said. Totally open to the idea of a discussion on it. Maybe I will get some of the people that I've named on the podcast and we will discuss that as well. If there's somebody specifically you'd like to see me have on the podcast to discuss something I've mentioned, let me know. Subscribe to the channel for more like this, and I will see you guys next time.